They arrested her for fake credentials. No questions, no hesitation, just steel handcuffs and a humiliating perp walk through the precinct lobby. Detective Reeves was already typing up the fraud charges when she leaned forward and whispered 6 words that made every cop in the building go dead silent. And what happened next didn't just clear her name, it exposed a corruption ring that had been operating under their noses for 3 years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But before we show you the exact code name that turned hardened detectives pale, and the classified file that made the police chief personally apologize on his knees, drop a comment telling us the most unbelievable case of mistaken identity you've ever witnessed. Hit subscribe with notifications on, because this story proves that sometimes the person you're arresting isn't the criminal. They're the one who's been hunting the real criminals all along. The rain hammered against the windows of Meridian City's 12th precinct like bullets against steel. Inside the cramped booking room, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across worn linoleum floors that had seen too many confessions, too many lies, and too many nights that stretched into dawn. It was 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday that felt like it would never end. Detective Ray Thurston had worked these streets for 15 years, long enough to spot a fake ID from across a crowded bar. He'd seen every scam, every forgery, every desperate attempt to become someone else. But the woman sitting across from him in interview room C was different. Not because she was innocent, he was certain she wasn't, but because she was too calm, too prepared, too comfortable in handcuffs for someone who claimed this was all a misunderstanding. Her name, according to the documents they'd confiscated, was Dr. Natasha Blackthorne, a forensic psychiatrist from the Federal Medical Research Institute. The credentials looked perfect, too perfect. Holographic seals, embedded security threads, government-grade paper stock. But Thurston's partner, Detective Linda Vasquez, had run the numbers twice. The institute existed, but they'd never heard of Dr. Blackthorne. The employee ID number belonged to someone else entirely. And the woman's fingerprints. They weren't in any federal database. You want to explain why you were found in a restricted government facility at midnight with fake federal credentials? Thurston asked, leaning back in his chair. The leather creaked under his weight, a sound that usually made suspects squirm. This woman didn't even blink. She was maybe 35, auburn hair pulled back in a professional bun, wearing a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than Thurston made in a month. No jewelry except a simple watch. No nervous tics, no fidgeting, no sweat on her forehead. Despite the broken air conditioning, she sat with perfect posture, hands folded, studying him like he was the one under investigation. "I've already told you," she said quietly, her voice carrying just a hint of an accent he couldn't place. "There's been a misunderstanding. If you would just contact who?" Detective Vasquez interrupted from the corner where she'd been observing. "The Federal Medical Research Institute that claims they've never employed anyone by your name? Or maybe you want us to call the fake phone numbers on your fake business cards?" The woman's eyes shifted to Vasquez for just a moment, then back to Thurston. "Detective, with respect, you're operating with incomplete information." Thurston almost laughed. "Lady, we caught you red-handed in a federal building after hours, carrying forged documents and a briefcase full of classified material you had no authorization to possess. The security footage shows you bypassing 3 separate checkpoints using credentials that don't exist. What part of that suggests we have incomplete information?" She tilted her head slightly, as if considering his question with genuine interest. "The part where you assume I wasn't supposed to be there." The confidence in her voice was unnerving. Thurston had interrogated murderers who showed more anxiety than this woman. Either she was a sociopath or... He pushed the thought away. 15 years on the force had taught him that when something seemed too good to be true, it usually was. And when someone claimed to be innocent with this much composure, they were usually guilty as hell. "Look, Dr. Blackthorne, or whoever you really are, here's how this works," Thurston said, standing up and walking to the small window that looked out onto the precinct's main floor. Through the glass, he could see the night shift going about their business. Patrol officers filing reports, detectives chasing leads, suspects in holding cells waiting for their lawyers. Normal police work for normal crimes committed by normal criminals. "You're looking at federal charges for document forgery, trespassing on government property, theft of classified materials, and identity fraud. That's 25 to life if the prosecutor decides to make an example of you. But if you cooperate, tell us who you're working for and how you got access to those documents. We might be able to work out a deal." He turned back to face her. She hadn't moved, hadn't even shifted in her chair. 25 to life, she repeated slowly, as if testing the words. "That would be problematic." "I'm sure it would be," Vasquez said. "Prison usually is problematic for people who aren't supposed to be there." For the first time since they'd brought her in, the woman smiled. It wasn't the nervous smile of someone trying to charm their way out of trouble, or the desperate smile of someone grasping at straws. It was the patient smile of someone who knew something they didn't. "Detective Thurston," she said, "before you file those charges, I need you to do one thing for me." "You're not really in a position to make demands," he replied. "I'm not making a demand. I'm making a request. One phone call to a number I'm going to give you. When they answer, you tell them you have Agent Codename Phoenix in custody and you need immediate verification of her operational status." The room went quiet except for the hum of the fluorescent lights and the distant sounds of the precinct beyond the door. Thurston exchanged a glance with Vasquez. Agent Codename Phoenix. It sounded like something out of a spy movie. "And what happens when we make this call?" Vasquez asked. The woman's smile widened slightly. "You find out why I was supposed to be in that building and why arresting me was the biggest mistake this precinct has made in its 50-year history." Thurston stared at her for a long moment. Every instinct told him this was another lie, another manipulation, but something in her eyes, a certainty that went beyond simple confidence, made him reach for his phone. He had no idea that the call he was about to make would change everything. 3 days earlier, the woman who would soon be sitting in handcuffs walked through the front doors of the Meridian City Police Department with the measured stride of someone who belonged there. She wore a simple navy blazer, carried a worn leather briefcase, and had the kind of unremarkable appearance that made people's eyes slide past her without really seeing. The desk sergeant barely looked up from his paperwork when she approached the front counter. Tuesday mornings were always slow at the 12th precinct. The weekend's chaos had been processed, and the real crimes wouldn't start happening until after lunch. "Can I help you?" Sergeant Rodriguez asked, not lifting his eyes from the incident report he was reviewing. "Domestic disturbance on Oak Street, nothing unusual." "Dr. Natasha Blackthorne," she said, placing a business card on the counter. "I have an appointment with Captain Williams regarding the psychological evaluation protocols for officer wellness checks." Rodriguez glanced at the card. Federal Medical Research Institute, impressive letterhead, government-grade cardstock. He'd seen plenty of federal contractors come through over the years, usually stuffy bureaucrats with clipboards and attitudes. This woman seemed different, though, quieter, almost invisible. "Captain's in his office," Rodriguez said, buzzing her through the security door. "3rd floor, end of the hall. He's expecting you." She wasn't carrying a clipboard. She wasn't wearing a visitor's badge. She walked past the bullpen like she'd been there 100 times before, her low heels making barely any sound on the worn tile floors. In the elevator, she stood perfectly still, hands folded over her briefcase, watching the floor numbers change with the patient attention of someone who had nowhere else to be. Detective Tommy Castellano was refilling his coffee mug when she walked past his desk. He glanced up, took in the professional attire, the federal contractor look, and immediately lost interest. "Another consultant," he muttered to his partner, Detective Sarah Brooks. "Probably here to tell us we're doing everything wrong." Brooks looked over her computer monitor just long enough to see the woman disappearing into the stairwell instead of continuing to the elevator. "Weird," she said. "Captain's office is up, not down." "Maybe she got turned around," Castellano shrugged. "These federal types never know where they're going anyway." But Dr. Natasha Blackthorne knew exactly where she was going. She'd studied the building schematics for 2 weeks, memorized every floor plan, every exit, every security checkpoint. The basement level housed the evidence lockers, the old case files, and most importantly, the digital records archive that connected to every law enforcement database in the tri-state area. She descended the stairs with the same measured pace, her briefcase containing equipment that looked like standard psychiatric evaluation tools but served an entirely different purpose. The hallway was empty except for a custodian mopping the floors near the far end. "Excuse me," she called out softly. "I'm looking for the archives department." The custodian, an older man named Frank, who'd been cleaning these floors for 12 years, pointed toward a door marked "Authorized Personnel Only." "Through there, but you need a key card. Most folks get lost down here their first time." She smiled, the kind of gentle, forgettable smile that made people want to help. "I'm sure I'll figure it out. Thank you." Frank went back to his mopping, already forgetting the encounter. Just another bureaucrat wandering around where she probably shouldn't be. Happened all the time. Upstairs in his office, Captain Williams was checking his calendar, wondering where his 9 a.m. appointment was. He'd received the email last Friday, something about updating the department's psychological evaluation procedures for officer wellness checks. Standard administrative stuff, the kind of meetings that filled his calendar but rarely resulted in meaningful change. He picked up his phone to call the front desk, but Rodriguez was already dealing with a walk-in complaint about noise violations. Williams made a mental note to follow up later and went back to reviewing budget reports. Federal contractors were notorious for showing up late anyway. Meanwhile, Dr. Blackthorne had made her way to the archives department, where a young clerk named Jessica Martinez was cataloging evidence from recent cases. The door was propped open and Jessica was listening to music through earbuds while she worked, completely absorbed in her task. "Excuse me," Dr. Blackthorne said, tapping gently on the door frame. Jessica looked up, pulling out one earbud. "Oh, hi. Sorry, didn't hear you come in. You looking for something specific?" "I'm Dr. Blackthorne from the Federal Medical Research Institute," she said, showing her credentials. "I'm conducting a study on law enforcement stress indicators, and I need to review some recent case files for psychological patterns in incident reports." Jessica examined the ID, which looked official enough. She'd seen federal contractors before, usually for audits or compliance checks. This seemed routine. "You'll need to sign in here," Jessica said, sliding a clipboard across the desk. "And I'll need to see some kind of authorization letter." Dr. Blackthorne reached into her briefcase and produced a document with the Federal Medical Research Institute letterhead, complete with official seals and signatures. It looked perfect because it was perfect, or rather, it was perfectly crafted to pass any casual inspection. "I just need access to closed cases from the past 18 months, she said, her tone professional but not pushy. specifically ones involving suspected corruption or internal investigations. Jessica hesitated for a moment. Those files were technically restricted, but the authorization looked legitimate, and federal research projects always seem to have broad access rights. "I can set you up in Conference Room B," Jessica said finally. "It's quieter back there, and I can bring you the files you need. Might take me a few minutes to pull everything together." "That would be perfect. Thank you." As Jessica disappeared into the file room, Dr. Blackthorne allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. Phase 1 complete. She was inside the system with access to exactly the information she needed, and nobody had questioned her presence beyond routine protocol checks. What none of them knew was that Dr. Natasha Blackthorne was indeed exactly who she claimed to be, just not in the way any of them understood, and the files she was about to review would reveal a pattern of corruption that reached much higher than a simple evidence clerk or desk sergeant could imagine. But first, she had to maintain her cover long enough to gather the proof she needed. In her experience, the best place to hide was in plain sight, especially when everyone expected you to be someone you weren't. The 12th Precinct had been Captain Marcus Williams's domain for 8 years, and he ran it like a man who understood that respect wasn't given. It was earned through results, loyalty, and an unspoken agreement that certain questions simply weren't asked. The building itself reflected this philosophy, a fortress of brick and steel that had weathered 5 decades of Meridian City's worst crimes, where the walls seemed to absorb secrets as efficiently as they absorbed the endless coffee stains and cigarette smoke from generations of cops who'd walked these halls. Williams's office occupied the corner of the 3rd floor, with windows that offered a commanding view of both the precinct's main entrance and the parking lot where patrol units came and went in their endless cycles. 2 American flags flanked his desk, one for the country, one for the state, along with commendations dating back to his days as a beat cop in the rougher neighborhoods downtown. But the real power symbols weren't on the walls. They were in the relationships he'd cultivated over nearly 3 decades in law enforcement. Detective Ray Thurston was one of those relationships. 15 years of partnership in everything but name. 15 years of understanding that sometimes justice required creative interpretation, and 15 years of mutual protection that had kept them both climbing the ladder while others fell by the wayside. Thurston knocked twice on Williams's door before entering, a habit left over from his early days when the captain's temper was less controlled and his tolerance for interruption was virtually non-existent. "You wanted to see me?" Thurston asked, settling into the worn leather chair across from Williams's desk. The office smelled like old coffee and the industrial-strength air freshener that never quite masked the underlying odors of stress, sweat, and secrets. Williams didn't look up from the file he was reviewing, a thick manila folder with red classification stamps that Thurston couldn't quite read from his angle. "Tell me about this federal contractor who was supposed to meet with me this morning, Dr. Blackthorne." "What about her?" Thurston replied, though something in Williams's tone made him sit up straighter. "She never showed for her appointment, far as I know. Rodriguez said she came through the lobby around 9, but nobody's seen her since." "That's because she's been in the basement for 3 hours, going through restricted case files with young Martinez in archives." Williams finally looked up, his expression unreadable. "Files that include some very specific investigations from the past 18 months. Thurston felt a familiar knot forming in his stomach, the same sensation he'd learned to recognize whenever Williams used that particular tone. It meant someone had gotten too close to something they weren't supposed to see, and it meant decisions would need to be made about how to handle the situation. Martinez shouldn't have given her access to restricted files, Thurston said carefully. I can talk to her. Make sure she understands the protocols. Martinez isn't the problem, Williams replied, sliding the folder across his desk. Take a look at this. Thurston opened the file and immediately understood why Williams was concerned. The documents inside detailed a pattern of evidence discrepancies, witness statements that had been altered, and case outcomes that didn't match the initial investigation findings. More troubling were the financial records, payments to offshore accounts, property purchases that exceeded legitimate police salaries, and a network of connections that stretched far beyond the 12th precinct. Where did this come from? Thurston asked, though he already suspected the answer. Internal. Affairs has been building this for 6 months, Williams said. Anonymous tips, financial audits, digital forensics on deleted files. Someone's been very thorough and very careful and very patient. He leaned back in his chair. The question is whether our Dr. Blackthorne is part of the investigation or if she's fishing for information to sell to the highest bidder. Detective Linda Vasquez appeared in the doorway, holding a stack of papers and wearing the expression of someone who'd discovered something unpleasant. Captain, we might have a problem with that federal contractor. What kind of problem? Williams asked, gesturing for her to close the door behind her. The kind where her credentials check out too well, Vasquez said, taking the seat next to Thurston. I ran her ID through every federal database I could access, and everything comes back clean. Too clean. Her employment history, her educational background, her security clearances. It all looks perfect. Perfect how? Thurston asked. Perfect like it was created by someone who knows exactly how federal background checks work, Vasquez explained. The dates line up, the references are legitimate. The documentation is flawless. But when I started making actual phone calls to verify details, I got transferred to voicemail systems that sound official but never seem to have anyone available to confirm or deny anything. Williams and Thurston exchanged glances. They'd both seen enough federal bureaucracy to know that real government employees were usually eager to disclaim responsibility for anything that wasn't directly their job. The kind of polite runaround Vasquez was describing suggested something more deliberate. There's more, Vasquez continued. The files she's been reviewing downstairs aren't random psychological case studies. She specifically requested access to every corruption investigation, every internal affairs inquiry, and every case involving evidence tampering from the past 18 months. The room fell silent except for the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sounds of normal police work continuing beyond Williams's office. Thurston could hear phones ringing, keyboards clicking, and the low murmur of conversations that weren't about federal contractors who might or might not be who they claimed to be. How long has she been down there? Williams asked. 3 hours and counting, Vasquez replied. Martinez says she's been taking notes, photographing documents, and asking very specific questions about case timelines and investigator assignments. Williams stood and walked to his window, looking down at the parking lot where patrol units were lined up in neat rows like soldiers waiting for orders. Each of those cars represented officers who trusted him to make the right decisions, who believed the system worked because people like him made sure it worked, even when the methods weren't strictly by the book. Gentlemen, he said without turning around, we have 2 possibilities here. Either Dr. Blackthorne is a legitimate federal investigator gathering evidence for a case we don't know about, or she's someone else entirely who's gotten very close to information that could be problematic. And if it's the second option? Thurston asked, though he already knew where this conversation was heading. Williams turned back to face them, his expression now showing the kind of cold calculation that had made him an effective captain for 8 years. Then we need to find out exactly who she is, who she's working for, and what she plans to do with the information she's gathered before she leaves this building. Vasquez checked her watch. She told Martinez she'd need about another hour to finish reviewing the files. "Perfect," Williams said. "That gives us time to prepare a proper reception for Dr. Blackthorne when she's ready to leave. I think it's time we had a more detailed conversation about her research methods." The plan they developed over the next 30 minutes was simple, elegant, and completely within their authority as law enforcement officers investigating suspicious activity on government property. They would approach Dr. Blackthorne as she attempted to leave the building, request additional identification and verification of her authorization, and detain her for questioning if anything seemed irregular about her responses. What they didn't anticipate was that Dr. Blackthorne had been listening to their entire conversation through the digital surveillance equipment she'd installed in Williams's office during her first week of preparation. And what they definitely didn't know was that everything they'd just discussed had been recorded and transmitted to a secure server that would ensure their words survived, regardless of what happened in the next few hours. The trap they thought they were setting had become the evidence that would ultimately destroy them. Dr. Natasha Blackthorne emerged from the basement archives at precisely 2:47 p.m., her briefcase slightly heavier with the photocopied documents and digital recordings she'd obtained during her 3-hour review. Jessica Martinez had been helpful beyond expectation, even volunteering additional files that might be relevant to her psychological research study. The young clerk had no way of knowing that every document she'd provided was another piece in a puzzle that would soon reshape the entire power structure of the 12th Precinct. The elevator ride to the main floor felt longer than usual, and Blackthorne used the time to mentally review her exit strategy. She'd learned long ago that the most dangerous moment in any undercover operation wasn't the infiltration, it was the extraction. People became suspicious when you tried to leave with information they wished they hadn't shared. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, revealing the precinct's main bullpen in the late afternoon lull. Detectives hunched over paperwork, patrol officers processed routine arrests and the familiar sounds of police work. Ringing phones, clicking keyboards, muffled conversations created a backdrop of institutional normalcy. Nothing appeared different from when she'd arrived that morning, but Blackthorne's trained senses detected subtle changes in the atmosphere. Detective Castellano was no longer at his desk reviewing case files. Instead, he stood near the coffee machine, positioned with a clear view of the elevator bank. Detective Brooks had abandoned her computer screen and was organizing files that didn't appear to need organizing, her attention divided between her paperwork and the main walkway toward the exit. Even Sergeant Rodriguez at the front desk seemed more alert, his casual morning demeanor replaced by the heightened awareness of someone expecting trouble. Blackthorne walked toward the exit with the same measured pace she'd maintained all day, her expression neutral, her posture professional. But her peripheral vision caught the subtle positioning of personnel, the way conversations stopped as she passed, the deliberate nature of movements that should have been routine. She'd seen this choreography before in other cities, in other precincts, when corrupt officers realized they were being investigated. "Dr. Blackthorne," Detective Thurston's voice carried just enough authority to make it clear this wasn't a casual greeting. He approached from the direction of the stairwell, flanked by Detective Vasquez, both of them wearing the practiced expressions of law enforcement officers conducting routine business. "Detective," she replied, stopping but not turning fully toward them. "I was just finishing up my research review. Quite informative, actually." "I'm sure it was," Thurston said, his tone carefully neutral. We were hoping we could ask you a few follow-up questions about your authorization for those files. Just routine verification, you understand. Vasquez moved to position herself slightly behind and to the left, not aggressively, but in a way that would make it difficult for Blackthorn to continue toward the exit without appearing to flee. Some of those documents you reviewed are classified at levels that require additional clearances, she added. We want to make sure all our protocols were followed properly. Blackthorn recognized the technique, a soft approach designed to make the subject feel like they were helping with routine administrative matters rather than being detained for questioning. She'd used similar tactics herself in other operations, and she knew that cooperation at this stage would only lead to more intrusive questions, and eventually to the discovery that her cover story, while sophisticated, wouldn't survive intensive scrutiny. Of course, she said, reaching into her briefcase, I have all my authorization documents right here. The movement was natural, professional, and exactly what both detectives expected. What they didn't expect was the speed and precision with which she retrieved not documents but a small device that looked like a standard digital recorder. Before either detective could react, she'd activated it and was speaking in a clear, measured voice. This is Agent Phoenix, Operation Spotlight compromised. Request immediate extraction protocol activation. Subjects are attempting detention under false pretenses. Thurston stepped forward, his hand moving instinctively toward his weapon. Ma'am, I need you to put that device down and authorization code Bravo 77 Alpha. Blackthorn continued, her eyes never leaving Thurston's face. Case file reference, Meridian PD corruption investigation, Priority 1 classification. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Both detectives had heard enough federal law enforcement terminology to recognize authentic protocol language, but the specificity of her statements suggested either elaborate preparation or legitimate authority. Vasquez reached for her radio, but Blackthorn's next words stopped her mid-motion. Detective Vasquez, I wouldn't recommend calling this in through normal channels. Your radio communications have been monitored for the past 72 hours as part of an ongoing federal investigation into corruption within this precinct. The statement was delivered with such casual authority that both detectives found themselves hesitating. Thurston's training told him to proceed with the detention. Suspicious individuals often claimed federal connections to avoid arrest, but something in Blackthorn's demeanor suggested she wasn't bluffing. You want to tell us what kind of investigation? Thurston asked, his hand still resting near his weapon but not drawing it. The kind that's been documenting evidence tampering, witness intimidation, and financial irregularities involving multiple members of this department, Blackthorn replied. The kind that's been building cases against specific individuals for conspiracy, racketeering, and violation of civil rights under color of authority. Vasquez felt a cold knot forming in her stomach. The language was too specific, too accurate to federal prosecution terminology. Either this woman was the most sophisticated con artist they'd ever encountered, or she was exactly who she claimed to be. And if she was, then their attempt to detain her had just escalated a routine investigation into something much more serious. Federal agents don't usually work alone, Thurston said, but his voice lacked the confidence it had held moments earlier. Federal agents don't usually announce their presence either, Blackthorn replied, but sometimes circumstances require improvisation. Behind them, other personnel in the bullpen had begun to notice the confrontation. Conversations grew quieter, and several officers found excuses to move closer to where the three were standing. The attention was exactly what none of them wanted, Thurston and Vasquez, because it suggested they might be making a mistake, and Blackthorn because it increased the likelihood that someone would make a rash decision that could compromise the entire operation. Look, Vasquez said, attempting to de-escalate. "Why don't we just call your supervisor and verify?" "My supervisor," Blackthorne interrupted, "is currently coordinating with the U.S. Attorney's Office to finalize indictments against several individuals in this building. Calling attention to this conversation would be counterproductive." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. If she was legitimate, interfering with her operation could result in federal charges against anyone who obstructed the investigation. If she wasn't legitimate, she was demonstrating an understanding of federal law enforcement procedures that suggested serious criminal sophistication. Thurston made his decision based on 15 years of experience that had taught him when to push and when to step back. This felt like a time to step back, at least until they could gather more information about exactly who they were dealing with. "Why don't we continue this conversation somewhere more private?" he suggested. "Conference room upstairs?" Blackthorne smiled for the first time since the confrontation began, but it wasn't a smile of relief. It was the patient smile of someone who had just watched their opponents make exactly the mistake they'd been hoping for. "Detective Thurston," she said quietly, "I think that's an excellent idea." What none of them realized was that Captain Williams was already on his way down from the third floor, having monitored the entire exchange through the precinct's security cameras. And what they definitely didn't know was that Blackthorne's extraction protocol hadn't been a bluff. Federal agents were already positioned outside the building, waiting for either her safe exit or her emergency signal. The next few minutes would determine whether this ended as a routine investigation or as a full-scale federal raid. Conference Room B on the second floor had seen its share of difficult conversations over the years: internal disciplinary hearings, witness interrogations, and the occasional federal compliance meeting that everyone attended but nobody enjoyed. The fluorescent lights cast everything in harsh relief, and the single table dominated the windowless space like an altar of uncomfortable truths. Captain Williams had chosen this room specifically because it was isolated from the main floor activity and equipped with recording equipment that could be activated or disabled depending on what kind of conversation needed to take place. Dr. Blackthorne sat with her back to the wall, briefcase beside her chair, hands folded calmly while the three officers arranged themselves across from her like a tribunal. Williams had arrived within minutes of Thurston's call, his expression carefully neutral but his eyes sharp with the kind of focused attention that came from recognizing a potential career-ending situation. "Dr. Blackthorne," Williams began, settling into his chair with deliberate authority, "I think we need to have a more thorough discussion about your presence here today." "I agree completely," she replied, her voice carrying the same professional tone she'd maintained since morning, "though I suspect we have different ideas about what needs to be discussed." Thurston opened a folder containing printouts of her credentials, spreading them across the table like evidence in a trial. "Let's start with these federal authorizations. We've had some difficulty verifying the specifics with your home office." "I'm sure you have," Blackthorne said. "The Federal Medical Research Institute maintains operational security protocols that limit information sharing, especially regarding ongoing investigations." Vasquez leaned forward. "What kind of ongoing investigations?" "The kind that examine patterns of corruption in local law enforcement agencies," Blackthorne answered without hesitation. "The kind that analyze how evidence manipulation affects case outcomes. The kind that document financial irregularities among public servants earning government salaries." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Williams kept his expression carefully controlled, but Thurston noticed the slight tightening around his captain's eyes that usually appeared when someone had pushed too far into territory that was supposed to remain unexplored. "Those are serious allegations," Williams said slowly. "I hope you have substantial evidence to support such claims." "I do," Blackthorne replied, reaching for her briefcase. The movement caused all three officers to tense, hands instinctively moving toward weapons, but she simply retrieved a tablet computer and placed it on the table. In fact, I've been documenting evidence for the past several months. She activated the tablet, and the screen displayed what appeared to be a sophisticated database with files organized by date, case number, and personnel involved. Thurston could see enough detail to recognize case numbers from investigations he'd worked, financial records that looked disturbingly familiar, and timestamps that corresponded to activities he remembered participating in. "This is interesting," Williams said, though his voice had acquired an edge that suggested his patience was wearing thin. "You've been conducting surveillance on this department without proper authorization." "I've been conducting research with full federal authorization," Blackthorne corrected. "Authorization that includes monitoring communications, financial transactions, and case handling procedures for any law enforcement agency suspected of systematic corruption." Vasquez felt her mouth go dry. If this woman was legitimate, if she had federal backing for the kind of comprehensive investigation she was describing, then half the department could be facing criminal charges. But if she wasn't legitimate, if this was an elaborate con game or blackmail scheme, then they needed to stop it before it went any further. "Let me ask you something," Thurston said, his detective instincts overriding his growing concern. "If you're really a federal agent conducting a corruption investigation, why are you here alone? Why the elaborate cover story? Why not coordinate with Internal Affairs or the district attorney's office?" Blackthorne's smile returned, but this time it held no warmth at all. "Because Internal Affairs has been compromised for over a year, Detective Thurston. Because the district attorney's office has been receiving case files that have been altered before they reach the prosecutors. And because coordination with local authorities would have meant warning the very people I was investigating." She touched the tablet screen, and a new file opened displaying what appeared to be recorded conversations. Williams recognized his own voice immediately, along with Thurston's and several other officers discussing cases in ways that would be difficult to explain to a jury. "The beauty of digital surveillance," Blackthorne continued, "is that it captures not just actions, but intentions. Not just what people do, but why they do it and how they justify it to themselves." Williams stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Dr. Blackthorne, I think this meeting is over. If you have allegations against members of this department, you can file them through proper channels. Until then, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." "I'm afraid that's not possible," Blackthorne said, remaining seated. "Federal agents don't leave active crime scenes, Captain Williams. And this precinct officially became a crime scene the moment you attempted to obstruct a federal investigation." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Thurston realized that everything they'd done in the past hour, from the initial approach to bringing her to this conference room, could be interpreted as interfering with federal law enforcement activities. If she was legitimate, they were all facing charges that could end their careers and land them in federal prison. "You want to prove you're a federal agent?" Vasquez asked, her voice strained. "Show us a badge. Show us official identification that we can verify independently." Blackthorne reached into her jacket pocket, and all three officers tensed again. But instead of credentials, she withdrew a small communication device that looked like a standard police radio, but with additional encryption equipment. "Federal Agent Phoenix to control," she spoke into the device. "Request immediate verification of operational status to local law enforcement. 3 subjects in custody require confirmation of federal authority." The response came through clearly, with the kind of professional precision that all 3 officers recognized from legitimate federal communications. "Agent Phoenix, this is Control. Your operational status is confirmed. Federal authority is verified for Operation Spotlight. Do you require immediate assistance? Negative on assistance, Blackthorne replied. Subjects are cooperative. Continuing interview protocol. She set the radio on the table where all 3 officers could see it. Gentlemen, you now have official confirmation that I am exactly who I claim to be. The question is whether you want to continue obstructing a federal investigation or whether you'd prefer to discuss cooperation. Williams sank back into his chair, the weight of the situation finally becoming clear. If this woman was a legitimate federal agent, everything they'd built over the past 8 years was about to come crashing down. The money, the favors, the careful network of mutual protection that had made them all successful. It was all documented somewhere in her files. But more immediately, they were now facing a choice between escalating their resistance to a federal investigation or finding a way to minimize the damage. And with each passing minute, escalation was looking less like a viable option. What kind of cooperation are you talking about? Thurston asked quietly. Blackthorne's expression softened slightly, as if she recognized that they'd reached the crucial turning point. The kind that acknowledges mistakes were made, provides full disclosure of illegal activities, and demonstrates genuine commitment to reform. And if we refuse? Williams asked. Then Operation Spotlight moves to Phase 2, she replied, which involves federal warrants, asset seizure, and the kind of media attention that destroys careers and lives. The choice, as she presented it, wasn't really a choice at all, but none of them realized that they were already past the point where cooperation could save them. The evidence was already compiled, the indictments were already being prepared, and this conversation was simply the final piece of documentation needed to demonstrate that they'd been given every opportunity to surrender peacefully. The trap had been set months ago. They were only now discovering that they'd been caught. The evening sky over Meridian City had turned the color of old bruises, purple and gray clouds gathering above the industrial district, where the 12th Precinct stood like a monument to institutional authority. Inside Conference Room B, the conversation had taken on the rhythm of a negotiation between adversaries who were only beginning to understand the true scope of their conflict. Captain Williams had dismissed the recording equipment an hour earlier, claiming it was malfunctioning, but Dr. Blackthorne knew that some conversations were too dangerous to be preserved in official records. Let's discuss specifics, Williams said, his voice carrying the careful tone of a man walking across thin ice. If there have been irregularities in certain case handling procedures, we're prepared to address those issues through internal review processes. Blackthorne opened a different file on her tablet, this one containing financial records that made all 3 officers shift uncomfortably in their chairs. Bank deposits that exceeded their legitimate salaries, property purchases that couldn't be explained through normal income, and a pattern of transactions that tracked directly to case outcomes in ways that would be difficult to present to a jury as coincidental. Detective Thurston, she said, your salary is $78,000 annually, yet you purchased a $340,000 vacation property in the mountains last year. The down payment was $85,000 in cash. Would you like to explain how you accumulated that amount of money? Thurston felt sweat forming on his forehead, despite the air conditioning. I've been saving for years, plus some family inheritance. From your Aunt Margaret, who died 3 years ago and left you $12,000, Blackthorne interrupted, consulting her records. That's documented in probate court, or perhaps you're referring to different family members who somehow escaped notice by the IRS when they made these substantial gifts. The level of detail she possessed was staggering. Not just financial records, but cross-referenced documentation that revealed the gaps between official explanations and verifiable facts. Vasquez realized that if Blackthorne had this level of information about Thurston, she likely had similar documentation about all of them. "What about you, Detective Vasquez?" Blackthorne continued, switching files with practiced efficiency. "Your children attend Meridian Academy, which charges $32,000 per year in tuition. That's $64,000 annually for both kids, nearly your entire take-home salary. Yet somehow you're also maintaining mortgage payments on a house worth $280,000 and making car payments on 2 vehicles." "My husband has income," Vasquez began. "Your husband drives a delivery truck for a logistics company. His W-2 forms show annual income of $41,000. Combined, your legitimate household income is approximately $119,000 before taxes, which works out to roughly $85,000 after standard deductions. Your documented expenses exceed $150,000 annually. That's a substantial gap." Williams watched his detectives absorb the implications of Blackthorne's presentation. She wasn't just fishing for information or making educated guesses. She had conducted a thorough financial investigation that would satisfy federal prosecution standards, the kind of meticulous documentation that required months of work and access to databases that local law enforcement couldn't touch without federal warrants. "You've been building cases against us for quite some time," Williams observed. "This wasn't a routine research visit." "Operation Spotlight has been active for 8 months, Blackthorne confirmed. "Your department was selected based on patterns of case outcomes that suggested systematic corruption. Convictions that should have been straightforward resulted in dismissals or plea bargains. Evidence that should have supported prosecutions mysteriously became inadmissible. Witnesses who provided clear testimony suddenly became unreliable or disappeared entirely. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us." Now back to the story. She opened another file, this one containing case records that all 3 officers recognized. The Rodriguez drug trafficking case, where 15 kilograms of cocaine had been ruled inadmissible due to chain of custody issues. The Brennan embezzlement case, where key financial records had been damaged in a supposed computer malfunction. The Morrison assault case, where the primary witness had suddenly recanted his testimony after years of consistency. Each of these cases involved evidence that was initially solid, prosecutions that should have been successful, and outcomes that benefited specific criminal organizations. Blackthorne continued. "When we analyzed the pattern, we discovered that the same officers were involved in evidence handling across multiple cases. The same supervisors approved questionable procedural decisions, and the same financial benefits appeared in the personal accounts of those officers shortly after problematic case resolutions." Thurston felt the walls of the conference room closing in around him. "You're describing coincidences. Correlation isn't causation." "You're absolutely right," Blackthorne agreed. "Which is why we didn't stop with financial analysis. We also documented communications, recorded conversations, and traced the flow of money from criminal organizations through intermediaries to law enforcement personnel." She activated an audio file, and William's voice filled the room with crystal clarity. "The Morrison thing needs to go away, whatever it takes. The witness is the problem. If he changes his story, the case falls apart. Make it happen." The recording was followed by Thurston's voice. "What about internal affairs? They've been asking questions." "Internal affairs asks questions when I tell them to ask questions," Williams replied on the recording. "And they stop asking questions when I tell them to stop. This stays between us until it's resolved." The audio quality was perfect, capturing not just words but tone, context, and clear evidence of intent to obstruct justice. Vasquez realized that they hadn't just been investigated, they'd been surveilled with the kind of sophisticated equipment that federal agencies used for organized crime cases. "How long have you been recording us?" Williams asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Every conversation that took place in this building for the past 90 days has been preserved," Blackthorne replied. "Every phone call, every private meeting, every discussion you thought was confidential. Federal surveillance authorization is quite comprehensive when it's properly obtained." The scope of the operation was becoming clear. This wasn't a single agent gathering random information. This was a coordinated federal investigation with full legal backing, sophisticated technology, and the kind of resources that suggested they were part of a much larger pattern of corruption that extended beyond the 12th Precinct. "What other departments are involved?" Vasquez asked. "That's classified information," Blackthorne said. "But I can tell you that Meridian City isn't unique. The Department of Justice has identified systematic corruption in law enforcement agencies across 17 states. Operation Spotlight is one of 43 concurrent investigations." Williams felt something cold settling in his chest. If this was part of a national investigation, if federal resources were being coordinated across multiple states, then the usual methods of containing local problems wouldn't be effective. You couldn't intimidate federal agents the way you could pressure local prosecutors. You couldn't make federal evidence disappear the way you could influence city records. And you couldn't negotiate with the Justice Department the way you could with county officials who depended on law enforcement support for their own political survival. "What happens now?" he asked. Blackthorne closed her tablet and placed her hands flat on the table, the gesture of someone preparing to deliver a final ultimatum. "Now you have a choice, Captain Williams. You can continue to pretend this is a misunderstanding that can be managed through normal channels, or you can acknowledge that federal law enforcement has documented sufficient evidence to destroy your careers, your finances, and your freedom. And if we acknowledge that, then we discuss the terms of your cooperation with ongoing federal investigations into the criminal organizations that have been paying for your services. We talk about asset forfeiture limitations in exchange for testimony against higher-level targets. We negotiate plea agreements that result in prison sentences measured in years rather than decades." The offer was presented with clinical precision, as if she were discussing insurance policies rather than the complete destruction of everything they'd built over the past decade. But underneath the professional language was an unmistakable message. Their only choice was between different degrees of catastrophic personal consequences. What none of them realized was that the choice itself was an illusion. The federal investigation was already complete. The indictments were already prepared, and this conversation was simply one final opportunity to document their responses when confronted with evidence of their crimes. The trap had already closed. They just hadn't heard the sound yet. The fluorescent lights in Conference Room B had taken on a harsh, interrogation-like quality as the evening stretched past 8 p.m. What had begun as a controlled attempt to manage a potential problem had evolved into something far more dangerous, a federal agent presenting evidence that could destroy careers, families, and lives. But Captain Williams had spent 8 years building his network of protection, and he wasn't prepared to surrender without exploring every possible avenue of resistance. "Dr. Blackthorne," Williams said, his voice taking on the harder edge that his subordinates recognized as a warning signal, "you've presented some interesting theories about financial irregularities and case handling issues. But theories aren't the same as prosecutable evidence, and allegations aren't the same as convictions." He stood and walked to the small window that looked out over the precinct's parking lot, where the evening shift was beginning their patrols. normal police work continuing while the foundation of their world was being systematically dismantled in a windowless conference room. More importantly, Williams continued, federal agents don't typically conduct investigations without coordination with local authorities. They don't work alone. They don't use elaborate cover stories. And they certainly don't conduct unauthorized surveillance operations against law enforcement personnel without proper judicial oversight. Blackthorne had been expecting this line of resistance. In her experience, corrupt officials always believed they could challenge federal authority through procedural objections, as if the same legal technicalities they'd learned to manipulate in local cases could somehow protect them from federal prosecution. "Captain Williams," she replied calmly, "are you suggesting that my federal authorization is fraudulent?" "I'm suggesting that your entire story has more holes than Swiss cheese," Williams said, turning back to face her. "And I'm suggesting that if you were really a federal agent conducting a legitimate investigation, you wouldn't be sitting in this room alone, negotiating plea bargains like some kind of freelance prosecutor." Thurston felt a spark of hope ignite in his chest. Williams was right. Something about this entire situation felt wrong. Federal agents worked in teams. They coordinated with local prosecutors. They didn't conduct months-long undercover operations without backup, and they certainly didn't reveal the scope of their investigations to the subjects they were targeting. "She's been playing us," Thurston said, his confidence returning. "Think about it. She shows up with perfect credentials that can't be verified, claims to have months of surveillance data that we never detected, and now she's offering to negotiate sentences, like she has the authority to make deals with the Justice Department." Vasquez looked between her colleagues and the woman sitting across from them, trying to reconcile the contradictory evidence. The financial records Blackthorne had presented were accurate, too accurate to be fabricated, but the procedural irregularities Williams and Thurston were pointing out were also valid concerns. "If you're really a federal agent," Vasquez said slowly, "then you won't mind if we verify your status through official channels. We can call the Justice Department directly, confirm your identity, and validate your authority to conduct this investigation." Blackthorne's expression didn't change, but something in her posture suggested that the conversation had taken an unexpected turn. "Detective Vasquez, I've already provided verification through proper federal communication channels. Attempting to contact other agencies could compromise ongoing operations and interfere with national security protocols." "National security," Williams laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "You're claiming that local police corruption is a matter of national security? That's quite a stretch, even for federal overreach." "Unless," Thurston added, his detective instincts finally engaging fully, "this isn't about police corruption at all, unless this is some kind of elaborate intelligence-gathering operation or industrial espionage, and we've been targeted for reasons that have nothing to do with the cases you've mentioned." The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Blackthorne realized that she'd underestimated the intelligence and paranoia of her targets. Corrupt cops developed survival instincts that made them suspicious of anything that seemed too convenient or too perfectly orchestrated. "Gentlemen," she said, maintaining her professional tone, "I understand your skepticism, but questioning federal authority is a dangerous path that could result in additional charges of obstruction and interference with a federal investigation. And conducting unauthorized surveillance operations against law enforcement personnel is a dangerous path that could result in charges of impersonating a federal officer," Williams countered, "which carries a sentence of up to 20 years in federal prison." The threat was delivered with the kind of cold precision that Williams had perfected over years of dealing with criminals who thought they were smarter than the system. But this time, he was using those same tactics against someone who might actually be smarter than the system, or who might be playing a game that none of them fully understood. Blackthorn reached for her communication device again, but Williams moved faster than she'd anticipated. His hand slammed down on the table, blocking her access to the equipment. "I don't think so," he said. "I think it's time we had a more honest conversation about who you really are and what you're really doing here." The atmosphere in the room shifted dramatically. The careful dance of professional courtesy and veiled threats was replaced by open confrontation and the kind of raw tension that preceded violence. Vasquez instinctively moved toward the door, positioning herself to prevent Blackthorn from leaving, while also ensuring her own escape route if the situation escalated further. "Dr. Blackthorn," Thurston said, his voice carrying the authority of 15 years in law enforcement, "you're going to remain seated while we verify your identity through proper channels. Any attempt to leave this room or contact outside parties will be considered evidence of fraudulent intent. And if your federal credentials don't check out," Williams added, "you're going to find yourself under arrest for impersonating a federal officer, conducting unauthorized surveillance, extortion, and whatever other charges we can make stick." Blackthorn looked between the three officers, who had transformed from nervous suspects into aggressive interrogators. The psychology of the situation had shifted completely. They were no longer afraid of her evidence because they'd convinced themselves that her authority was fraudulent. "This is a mistake, Captain Williams," she said quietly. "A very serious mistake that you'll regret for the rest of your career." "The only mistake," Williams replied, "was letting you run this scam for as long as we did. But that ends now." He reached for the phone on the conference room table, intending to call the Federal Bureau of Investigation directly and demand verification of Agent Phoenix's identity and operational status. It was a logical move, a professional response to suspicious circumstances, and exactly the kind of aggressive law enforcement action that would normally expose fraudulent federal claims. What Williams didn't know was that the phone call he was about to make would trigger a series of events that had been carefully planned for exactly this scenario. Federal agents didn't work alone when they were conducting operations against corrupt law enforcement officials. They worked with extensive backup, sophisticated communication systems, and contingency plans for every possible outcome, including the possibility that their cover would be blown and that local law enforcement would attempt to verify their credentials through official channels. The phone rang twice before a professional voice answered, "Federal Bureau of Investigation, how may I direct your call?" Williams felt a moment of satisfaction. Finally, they were going to get some real answers about Dr. Natasha Blackthorn and her alleged federal investigation. "This is Captain Williams, 12th Precinct, Meridian City Police Department. I need immediate verification of the identity and operational status of a federal agent who claims to be conducting an investigation in my jurisdiction." "One moment, Captain Williams. I'll connect you to the appropriate office." The hold music played for exactly 37 seconds before a new voice came on the line, older, more authoritative, with the kind of measured precision that suggested significant rank and experience. "Captain Williams, this is Assistant Director Morrison, Federal Bureau of Investigation. I understand you have Agent Phoenix in custody and are questioning her operational authority." Williams felt his confidence evaporate, like steam from a cup of coffee. The voice on the phone wasn't just confirming Blackthorn's identity, it was treating her detention as a serious breach of federal law enforcement protocol. "Assistant Director," Williams began, but Morrison interrupted him before he could continue. "Captain, I'm going to need you to release Agent Phoenix immediately and provide her with full cooperation for the remainder of her mission. Any interference with her operation could result in federal charges against you and your department. The phone call that was supposed to expose Blackthorn as a fraud had instead confirmed her authority and escalated the situation to the highest levels of federal law enforcement. Williams realized that he'd just made the kind of career-ending mistake that would be studied in police academies as an example of how not to handle federal investigations, but it was already too late to undo the damage. The conversation was being recorded, the threats had been made, and 3 corrupt cops had just demonstrated exactly the kind of obstruction and intimidation that federal investigators had been documenting for months. The trap hadn't just closed, it had snapped shut with the sound of their own voices, providing the final evidence needed to destroy them. The silence that followed Assistant Director Morrison's words stretched across Conference Room B like a death sentence. Captain Williams stood frozen with the phone receiver in his hand, watching 8 years of careful career construction crumble in real time. Detective Thurston had gone pale, his earlier confidence replaced by the sick realization that they'd just escalated a manageable situation into a federal incident that would destroy everything they'd built. Detective Vasquez slowly backed away from the door, no longer positioning herself to prevent Blackthorn's escape, but rather trying to distance herself from what was rapidly becoming the worst decision of her professional life. Captain Williams, Morrison's voice continued through the phone, with the kind of patience that suggested he'd dealt with similar situations before. I'm going to need verbal confirmation that Agent Phoenix has been released from detention and that your department will provide full cooperation with her ongoing investigation. Williams looked at Blackthorn, who sat with the same composed expression she'd maintained throughout the entire confrontation. No triumph, no vindication, just the professional calm of someone who'd watched a predictable scenario unfold exactly as anticipated. Agent Phoenix she's free to continue her work, Williams said into the phone, his voice barely audible. Excellent, Morrison replied. Agent Phoenix, I trust you're able to proceed with Phase 2 of Operation Spotlight without further interference. Blackthorn leaned forward slightly to speak toward the phone. Affirmative, Director. Local resistance has been documented and will be included in the final report. Very good. Captain Williams, Agent Phoenix will be concluding her investigation over the next 24 hours. I expect your full cooperation during this period, and I expect that any evidence or personnel she requires will be made available without delay or obstruction. The line went dead, leaving the 4 occupants of Conference Room B to contemplate the wreckage of what had once been a controlled situation. Williams set the phone down with the careful precision of someone handling explosives, as if sudden movements might trigger additional catastrophes. Phase 2? Thurston asked quietly. Blackthorn opened her briefcase and retrieved a thick manila folder that none of them had seen before. The documents inside bore federal court seals, Justice Department letterheads, and the kind of official formatting that suggested they'd been prepared by people with significantly more authority than anyone in the 12th Precinct. Phase 2 involves the execution of federal warrants for the arrest of Captain Marcus Williams, Detective Raymond Thurston, and Detective Linda Vasquez on charges of conspiracy, racketeering, bribery, obstruction of justice, and violation of civil rights under color of authority, she said, reading from a document that looked disturbingly official. The words hit the room like physical blows. Vasquez felt her knees go weak and had to steady herself against the wall. Thurston's mouth went dry as he processed the scope of the charges they were facing. Williams sat down heavily, the weight of federal prosecution settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. However, Blackthorn continued, the timing and manner of these arrests can be influenced by your level of cooperation during the final phase of this investigation. What kind of cooperation? Williams asked, his voice hollow. The kind that acknowledges guilt, provides complete disclosure of criminal activities, and demonstrates genuine commitment to helping federal investigators dismantle the broader network of corruption that extends beyond this precinct. She opened the folder and spread additional documents across the table. Organizational charts showing connections between the 12th precinct and other law enforcement agencies, financial records indicating money flows from criminal organizations to public officials across 3 counties, and communication logs that revealed coordination between corrupt officers in multiple jurisdictions. This isn't just about your individual crimes, Blackthorne explained. You're part of a network that includes prosecutors, judges, federal contractors, and organized crime figures operating across state lines. The Justice Department isn't interested in prosecuting low-level corruption when they can use that evidence to dismantle entire criminal enterprises. Thurston studied the documents, recognizing names and connections that painted a picture far more complex than anything he'd imagined. They weren't just corrupt cops who'd made questionable decisions. They were part of an organized criminal network that had penetrated multiple levels of government. You want us to testify against other people, Vasquez said. You want us to become informants. I want you to provide truthful testimony about criminal activities you've witnessed, participated in, or facilitated, Blackthorne corrected. The label doesn't matter, the cooperation does. Williams realized that the federal investigation had been building toward this moment from the beginning. They'd been allowed to continue their activities while federal agents documented everything, gathering evidence not just against them, but against everyone they'd dealt with. They were small fish being offered the chance to help catch bigger fish. And if we refuse, he asked, then you'll be arrested tomorrow morning by federal agents. Your assets will be seized under federal forfeiture laws, and you'll face prosecution with the full resources of the Justice Department working to ensure maximum sentences, Blackthorne replied matter-of-factly. Given the evidence we've compiled, you're looking at 15 to 20 years in federal prison. And if we cooperate? Thurston asked. Then you'll be arrested tomorrow morning by federal agents. Your assets will be partially seized under federal forfeiture laws, and you'll face prosecution with the understanding that your cooperation will be presented to the court as a mitigating factor during sentencing, she said. You're looking at 5 to 8 years in federal prison, with the possibility of reduced sentences based on the value of your testimony. The choice she was offering wasn't really a choice at all. It was a selection between different degrees of catastrophic consequences. But for people facing the complete destruction of everything they'd worked for, even limited options felt like lifelines. How do we know you'll honor any agreements we make? Williams asked. Blackthorne retrieved one final document from her briefcase, a cooperation agreement with Justice Department letterheads, federal prosecutor signatures, and legal language that outlined specific terms for reduced sentences in exchange for truthful testimony. Because everything we discuss from this point forward is being recorded and will become part of the official federal case file, she said, indicating a small digital recorder that had been running since she'd activated it during their initial confrontation. The Justice Department doesn't make deals it doesn't intend to honor, Captain Williams. Unlike local prosecutors, federal attorneys don't depend on law enforcement cooperation for their careers. Vasquez sank into her chair, finally understanding the full scope of what they were facing. This wasn't a negotiation or a misunderstanding that could be resolved through departmental politics. This was a federal criminal case that had been building for months, with evidence that would satisfy prosecution standards and cooperation agreements that represented their only chance of avoiding decades in prison. Exactly do you need from us? She asked. Names, dates, financial arrangements, and detailed descriptions of how evidence was manipulated. Witnesses were intimidated and cases were fixed, Blackthorne replied. Complete disclosure of every criminal act you've committed, witnessed, or facilitated during your time with this department. And then you'll testify before federal grand juries, provide evidence for additional investigations, and help the Justice Department prosecute criminal organizations that have been operating under the protection of corrupt law enforcement. The transformation was complete. In the span of a few hours, they'd gone from confident law enforcement officers managing a minor problem to federal defendants facing decades in prison. The woman they'd thought they could intimidate or discredit had proven to be exactly who she claimed to be, with resources and authority that dwarfed anything they could bring to bear. But more importantly, they'd learned that their individual corruption was part of something much larger, a network of criminal activity that federal investigators had been mapping for months. They weren't the targets of this investigation. They were the pathway to the real targets, the evidence that would allow federal prosecutors to dismantle organized crime operations that extended far beyond the 12th Precinct. The only question now was whether they would cooperate willingly or be compelled to cooperate through the federal prison system. Either way, their careers in law enforcement were over, and their futures would be determined by how much help they could provide to the same federal justice system they'd spent years trying to circumvent. The transformation of Conference Room B from an interrogation chamber back to a federal briefing room happened with startling efficiency. Agent Blackthorne, no longer maintaining the pretense of being Dr. Blackthorne, had shed her academic cover like a snake discarding old skin. Her posture straightened, her voice carried new authority, and her movements became precise in the way that spoke of extensive federal training rather than academic research. She activated a second communication device, this one clearly federal equipment rather than the standard police radio she'd used earlier. Control, this is Phoenix. Phase 2 initiated. Subjects are cooperative. Request immediate deployment of arrest teams and evidence processing units. The response came through with crystal clarity. Phoenix, this is Control. Federal units are standing by. ETA 12 minutes. Local cooperation confirmed? Affirmative. Local subjects understand their situation and are prepared to provide initial statements. Williams watched this exchange with the detached fascination of someone observing his own execution. The woman who'd spent the day reviewing case files in the basement had become a federal agent coordinating a major law enforcement operation with resources that extended far beyond anything the 12th Precinct could muster. 12 minutes, Blackthorne announced, ending her communication. That's how long you have to decide whether you want to be arrested as cooperative witnesses or as hostile defendants. Vasquez felt her last hope of controlling the situation slip away. You've had federal agents surrounding this building all day? Federal agents have been monitoring this operation since it began 8 months ago, Blackthorne confirmed. The 12th Precinct has been under comprehensive surveillance, including electronic monitoring, financial investigation, and behavioral analysis. Every conversation, every transaction, every decision has been documented. She opened her briefcase and began removing items that revealed the true sophistication of the federal operation. Recording devices disguised as standard office equipment, financial tracking software that could trace money flows in real time, and communication equipment that had allowed her to coordinate with federal teams throughout her supposed research visit. Detective Thurston, she continued, the conversation you had with Captain Williams last Tuesday about the Henderson case, when you discussed altering witness statements to ensure an acquittal. That conversation took place in Williams's office at 3:47 p.m. and was recorded through surveillance equipment that had been installed in the ventilation system. Thurston felt his stomach drop. The Henderson case had involved a drug dealer who'd been paying them for protection. They'd thought that conversation was completely private. Detective Vasquez, your phone call to Assistant District Attorney Morrison on Friday, when you provided advance warning about the federal audit of case files. That call was intercepted and recorded by federal monitoring equipment. Morrison, incidentally, has been under federal investigation for the past 6 months. The scope of the surveillance was becoming clear. They hadn't just been watched, they'd been comprehensively monitored by federal agents with resources that made local law enforcement look like children playing with toy badges. Captain Williams, Blackthorne said, her voice taking on the tone of someone delivering a final verdict, your meeting with Vincent Russo last month, where you accepted $50,000 in cash in exchange for ensuring that the Martinelli racketeering case would be compromised through evidence tampering. That meeting took place at the Harborview restaurant, and it was observed and photographed by federal agents using long-range surveillance equipment. Williams closed his eyes. Vincent Russo was a known, organized crime figure whose family had been under federal investigation for decades. Taking money from Russo hadn't just been corruption. It had been direct collaboration with organized crime, the kind of federal offense that carried mandatory minimum sentences. The federal investigation identified a network of corruption that extends through 17 law enforcement agencies, 12 prosecutors' offices, and 6 federal contracting companies, Blackthorne continued. The total amount of money involved exceeds $40 million over the past 3 years. You're not small-time criminals who made bad decisions. You're part of an organized criminal enterprise that has systematically corrupted law enforcement across multiple states. Through the conference room window, they could see vehicles arriving in the parking lot. Not local police cars, but federal sedans and unmarked vans with the distinctive appearance of law enforcement vehicles designed for serious operations. Men and women in federal windbreakers were positioning themselves around the building's exits. Those are federal arrest teams, Blackthorne explained unnecessarily. They're here to execute warrants that have been prepared and approved by federal judges based on 8 months of documented evidence. The arrests are happening regardless of your cooperation. The only question is whether you'll be processed as cooperative witnesses or as hostile defendants. Vasquez watched through the window as more federal agents arrived, their movements coordinated and professional in a way that suggested extensive planning and preparation. This wasn't a hastily organized response to unexpected developments. This was the culmination of a long-term federal operation that had been building toward this moment. What exactly happens if we cooperate? Thurston asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Blackthorne opened the cooperation agreement again, pointing to specific sections that outlined the terms. You'll be arrested and charged with federal crimes, but you'll be processed separately from other defendants. You'll be housed in federal facilities designed for cooperating witnesses rather than general population. You'll work with federal prosecutors to provide testimony against higher-level targets, and your sentences will be reduced based on the value of your cooperation. And if we don't cooperate, you'll be arrested and charged with the same federal crimes, but you'll be processed as hostile defendants. You'll be housed in general population federal facilities. You'll have no opportunity to influence your sentences through cooperation, and you'll face the full resources of the federal justice system working to ensure maximum penalties. She stood and walked to the window, looking down at the federal agents who were now clearly visible in the parking lot. Gentlemen, this investigation has been building cases against organized crime families, corrupt politicians, and criminal enterprises operating across state lines. You're valuable to federal prosecutors not because of the crimes you've committed, but because of what you've witnessed and who you can testify against. Williams realized that they'd been trapped from the beginning, but not in the way he'd initially thought. They hadn't been caught because they'd made mistakes or because their security had failed. They'd been caught because federal investigators had been patient enough to let them continue their activities while building comprehensive evidence not just against them, but against everyone they'd dealt with. Vincent Russo, Assistant District Attorney Morrison, Judge Patterson, federal contractor David Chen, all of them are going to be arrested based on evidence you've helped federal agents gather, Blackthorne continued. The question is whether you want to be remembered as the criminals who helped bring down a criminal network, or as the criminals who were brought down by that network. Through the conference room door, they could hear federal agents entering the building, their voices professional and controlled as they coordinated with local personnel. The sound of their own colleagues being directed by federal authority was perhaps more demoralizing than anything else that had happened. "We need an answer," Blackthorne said, returning to the table. "Federal agents are prepared to execute arrest warrants with or without your cooperation, but the cooperation agreements expire when those arrests begin." Vasquez looked at her colleagues, seeing the same mixture of fear, resignation, and desperate hope that she felt in her own chest. They'd spent years believing they were smart enough to stay ahead of any investigation, sophisticated enough to cover their tracks, and connected enough to avoid serious consequences. But federal investigators had been smarter, more sophisticated, and better connected, and now their only choice was between different degrees of complete personal and professional destruction. "We'll cooperate," Williams said finally, his voice carrying the weight of surrender. "We'll provide whatever testimony and evidence you need." Blackthorne nodded and activated her communication device one final time. "Control, this is Phoenix. Subjects have agreed to full cooperation. Request processing as cooperative witnesses under existing agreements." "Confirmed, Phoenix. Federal teams are moving to arrest positions. Expect contact in 60 seconds. The sound of footsteps in the hallway grew louder, accompanied by the professional voices of federal agents who had spent months preparing for this moment. The trap that had been 8 months in the making was finally closing, and 3 corrupt cops were about to discover what federal justice looked like when it was applied with the full resources of the United States government. But they were no longer just criminals facing punishment. They had become weapons in a federal arsenal, aimed at dismantling criminal organizations much larger and more dangerous than anything they had imagined when they first decided that their badges could be used for personal profit. The doors to Conference Room B opened with the precise timing of a military operation. Federal agents and Navy windbreakers moved with the coordinated efficiency of professionals who had executed similar operations dozens of times before. Agent Sarah Chen, the lead federal prosecutor assigned to Operation Spotlight, entered first, followed by 2 U.S. Marshals whose presence transformed the atmosphere from tense negotiation to formal federal custody proceedings. Captain Marcus Williams, Detective Raymond Thurston, Detective Linda Vasquez, Agent Chen announced, her voice carrying the authority of federal law enforcement, backed by months of investigation and judicial approval. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to violate civil rights, bribery of public officials, obstruction of justice, and racketeering in violation of federal statutes." The Miranda warnings that followed were delivered with practiced precision, each word clearly enunciated and legally required, despite the fact that all 3 defendants had already agreed to cooperation. Federal procedures demanded strict adherence to constitutional protections, especially when dealing with law enforcement personnel who understood exactly how those protections could be challenged in court. Williams felt the cold steel of federal handcuffs close around his wrists. Not the standard police handcuffs he'd applied to hundreds of suspects over his career, but federal restraints that symbolized the complete transfer of authority from local law enforcement to the federal justice system. The sensation was surreal, like watching someone else's arrest from inside his own body. Agent Blackthorne remained seated throughout the arrest process, no longer the academic researcher or even the undercover federal agent, but now revealed as the supervising intelligence officer who had coordinated every aspect of an investigation that had taken 8 months to reach this conclusion. Her transformation was complete, from invisible observer to federal authority figure, whose work had just resulted in the arrest of 3 corrupt police officers and the opening of cases against dozens of additional targets. Agent Phoenix, Agent Chen said formally, "Please confirm the completion of Phase 2 objectives." "Confirmed," Blackthorne replied, consulting a tablet that displayed operational checklists and evidence summaries. "Primary subjects have been secured, cooperation agreements have been signed, and initial debriefing protocols can begin immediately. All surveillance data has been preserved, and evidence packages have been prepared for prosecution." Outside the conference room, the 12th Precinct had been transformed into a federal crime scene. FBI evidence technicians moved through the building with systematic thoroughness, seizing computers, files, and electronic equipment that would be analyzed for additional evidence of corruption. Federal agents interviewed patrol officers and administrative personnel, separating those who were potential witnesses from those who might be additional subjects of investigation. Sergeant Rodriguez watched from his desk as federal agents photographed and cataloged evidence that had been hidden in plain sight for years. The safe in Captain Williams' office contained $85,000 in cash that couldn't be explained through legitimate police work. Detective files included notes about case dispositions that clearly referenced payments from criminal defendants. Computer hard drives contained communications with organized crime figures that would provide federal prosecutors with evidence of ongoing criminal enterprises. "Detective Vasquez," Agent Chen said, reading from a federal booking sheet, "your initial debriefing will begin immediately following your processing. Federal prosecutors need detailed information about your financial arrangements with organized crime figures, your methods for manipulating evidence, and your knowledge of similar activities by other law enforcement personnel." Vasquez nodded, understanding that her cooperation would now be measured not just by her willingness to admit her own crimes, but by the completeness and accuracy of her testimony about criminal activities she had witnessed or participated in. Federal prosecutors weren't interested in individual guilt. They wanted to use that guilt to build cases against entire criminal networks. "Detective Thurston," Chen continued, "your debriefing will focus specifically on your relationship with Vincent Russo's organization, your role in compromising federal investigations, and your knowledge of corruption in the district attorney's office. Federal grand juries will need detailed testimony about specific incidents, financial transactions, and communications with criminal targets." The scope of what federal prosecutors expected from their cooperation was becoming clear. They weren't just admitting to their own crimes, they were providing the foundation for a comprehensive federal prosecution of organized crime activities that extended far beyond the 12th Precinct. Captain Williams was led past his own office, where federal agents were systematically dismantling 8 years of carefully constructed authority. His commendations were being photographed as evidence of his position and influence. His personnel files were being seized to document his ability to protect criminal activities. His computer was being imaged to preserve every communication that might reveal additional criminal associations. "Captain Williams," Agent Chen said, consulting her federal case file. Your debriefing will be the most comprehensive. Federal prosecutors need detailed information about your network of corrupt officials, your relationships with federal contractors involved in money laundering, and your knowledge of judicial corruption in federal courts. The revelation that federal courts had been compromised hit Williams like a physical blow. He'd assumed that corruption was limited to local law enforcement and state prosecutors. Learning that federal judges were part of the investigation meant that criminal networks had penetrated levels of government he'd never imagined were accessible to organized crime. As they were led from the precinct, Williams could see that the federal operation extended far beyond their arrests. Additional federal vehicles were positioned throughout Meridian City, executing simultaneous arrests of prosecutors, judges, and criminal figures who were part of the network that federal investigators had been mapping for 8 months. The scale of Operation Spotlight was becoming visible. Not just a corruption investigation targeting individual police officers, but a coordinated federal effort to dismantle criminal enterprises that had corrupted multiple levels of government across several states. They weren't the primary targets. They were evidence in cases against people with far more power and influence than local police officers could ever possess. Agent Phoenix, Chen said as the 3 defendants were loaded into separate federal vehicles. Assistant Director Morrison requests immediate briefing on Phase 3 timeline and resource requirements. Phase 3 involves prosecution of 47 additional targets across 6 states, Blackthorne replied, reading from her operational summary. Federal grand jury proceedings will begin next week, with trials scheduled to commence within 90 days. Resource requirements include additional federal prosecutors, witness protection services, and coordination with multiple U.S. attorney offices. Williams realized that their arrests were just the beginning of a federal prosecution effort that would continue for months or years. Federal investigators had been building cases, not just against them, but against everyone they'd ever dealt with in their criminal activities. The cooperation they'd agreed to provide would keep them in federal custody, giving testimony and providing evidence long after their own cases had been resolved. As the federal vehicles left the 12th precinct, Williams saw that local news crews were already positioned outside the building. The arrest of 3 police officers for federal corruption charges would be front-page news, but it would also serve as a warning to other law enforcement personnel who might be involved in similar activities. Federal investigations didn't just target individual criminals. They dismantled entire networks and sent messages that corruption would be prosecuted with the full resources of the federal justice system. The public humiliation of their arrests was part of the deterrent effect that federal prosecutors hoped would prevent other law enforcement personnel from making the same choices. But for Williams, Thurston, and Vasquez, the public consequences were secondary to the personal reality they now faced. Their careers were over. Their families would suffer the stigma of federal corruption charges, and their futures would be determined by federal judges applying federal sentencing guidelines that treated corruption as a serious threat to democratic institutions. The cooperation agreements they'd signed weren't just legal documents. They were contracts that would define the remainder of their lives, trading reduced prison sentences for testimony that would destroy other people's careers and lives. They had become weapons in a federal arsenal, aimed at criminal networks they'd never fully understood they were part of. And Agent Phoenix, whose careful investigation had made all of this possible, was already planning Phase 3 operations that would extend the federal crackdown to additional cities and additional networks of corruption that threatened the integrity of American law enforcement. The trap hadn't just closed. It had revealed itself as part of a much larger machine designed to protect democratic institutions from the kind of systematic corruption that had made their crimes possible in the first place. 6 months later, the Meridian City Federal Courthouse stood as a monument to institutional justice, its granite columns and bronze doors bearing witness to the conclusion of Operation Spotlight's most significant prosecutions. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps, where reporters had gathered for months to cover trials that had exposed corruption reaching from street-level police officers to federal contractors with security clearances that should have made them untouchable. Agent Sarah Phoenix, her real name as it turned out, though Dr. Natasha Blackthorne had been a carefully constructed identity that had served its purpose perfectly, walked through the courthouse lobby with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had spent 2 years building cases that would reshape law enforcement practices across multiple states. The marble floors reflected her footsteps as she made her way to the federal prosecutor's office for what would be her final briefing on Operation Spotlight's outcomes. The transformation of the federal investigation from a corruption probe targeting individual police officers into a comprehensive dismantling of organized crime networks had exceeded even the Justice Department's most optimistic projections. 47 defendants across 6 states had been convicted on federal charges ranging from bribery and racketeering to money laundering and conspiracy to violate civil rights. Prison sentences totaling more than 600 years had been imposed, and asset forfeitures had recovered over $85 million in criminal proceeds. Captain Marcus Williams had received 8 years in federal prison after providing testimony that had been instrumental in convicting Vincent Russo and 3 other organized crime figures. His cooperation had been comprehensive and valuable, resulting in the recommended sentence reduction, but it had also required him to detail every aspect of his criminal activities in open court, ensuring that his law enforcement career would never be restored. Detective Raymond Thurston's sentence of 6 years had reflected his lower position in the criminal hierarchy, but his testimony about evidence tampering and witness intimidation had provided federal prosecutors with the specific details needed to secure convictions against corrupt prosecutors and judges. His cooperation had been complete, but it had come at the cost of admitting to crimes that had allowed dangerous criminals to escape justice for years. Detective Linda Vasquez had received the shortest sentence, 4 years, primarily because her role had been more limited and her cooperation had begun earliest in the investigation. Her testimony about financial irregularities and money laundering had helped federal agents trace criminal proceeds through banking systems that organized crime figures had believed were secure from law enforcement scrutiny. But the most significant outcomes of Operation Spotlight extended far beyond individual prosecutions. The federal investigation had exposed systematic vulnerabilities in law enforcement oversight that had allowed corruption to flourish undetected for years. Congressional hearings had resulted in new federal legislation requiring enhanced financial monitoring of law enforcement personnel, mandatory rotation of assignments to prevent the development of compromising relationships, and expanded federal oversight of local police departments. Phoenix reviewed the final case summaries in her federal office, a space that bore no resemblance to the academic consulting identity she had maintained for 8 months. Federal law enforcement awards covered the walls, along with commendations from multiple U.S. attorneys whose prosecution efforts had been supported by her undercover work. The meticulous documentation that had seemed like academic research had become the foundation for federal cases that had dismantled criminal enterprises operating across state lines. Assistant Director Morrison knocked on her door, carrying the kind of thick briefing folder that indicated new assignments and fresh challenges. "Agent Phoenix, I trust you're ready for your next operation." "Always," she replied, closing the Operation Spotlight files for the final time. "Where am I going?" "Portland, Oregon. The DEA has identified a network of corrupt federal agents who've been providing protection for international drug trafficking operations. We need someone with your particular expertise in long-term undercover work and institutional analysis." Phoenix smiled, recognizing the familiar excitement that came with new challenges and complex investigations. "Cover identity?" "Dr. Emma Richardson, forensic accountant, specializing in federal agency financial auditing. You'll be conducting a routine compliance review of DEA financial practices while actually documenting evidence of corruption, money laundering, and conspiracy charges that could reach the highest levels of federal law enforcement." The cycle was beginning again. A new identity, a new location, and a new network of criminals who believed they were too sophisticated, too well protected, and too careful to be caught by federal investigators. They would discover, as Captain Williams and his colleagues had discovered, that patient federal investigations supported by comprehensive resources could penetrate any criminal network, regardless of how carefully it had been constructed. Phoenix gathered her personal items, leaving behind the Dr. Blackthorne identity materials that would be archived in federal evidence storage. The Federal Medical Research Institute credentials, the academic publications, and the scholarly research equipment had served their purpose and would never be needed again. Like all successful undercover identities, Dr. Blackthorne would disappear completely, leaving no trace that could compromise future operations. The success of Operation Spotlight had demonstrated that systematic corruption could be defeated through patient investigation, comprehensive surveillance, and the willingness to build cases that addressed entire criminal networks rather than individual crimes. Federal prosecutors had proven that organized crime's penetration of law enforcement could be reversed through coordinated federal action that treated corruption as a serious threat to democratic institutions. As Phoenix left the Meridian City federal courthouse for the final time, she reflected on the lessons that Operation Spotlight had provided for both law enforcement and the criminal organizations that sought to corrupt it. Corruption was not inevitable, but preventing it required constant vigilance, sophisticated investigative techniques, and the commitment of resources that only federal agencies could provide. The criminals who had believed they could buy protection from law enforcement scrutiny had learned that federal investigations could be more patient, more thorough, and more sophisticated than any criminal network. The law enforcement personnel who had believed they could profit from their badges without consequences had discovered that federal justice applied the same standards to everyone, regardless of their position or influence. Most importantly, Operation Spotlight had sent a message to both criminals and law enforcement personnel that systematic corruption would be met with systematic federal response. The Justice Department's willingness to commit the resources necessary for long-term investigations had demonstrated that no criminal network was too sophisticated, too well-connected, or too careful to avoid federal prosecution. Phoenix climbed into her federal vehicle, already mentally preparing for the challenges that Dr. Emma Richardson would face in Portland. The work would be dangerous, demanding, and crucial to maintaining the integrity of federal law enforcement. But it was work that made the difference between criminal networks that operated with impunity and criminal networks that faced the full consequences of federal justice. The trap that had closed around the 12th Precinct had been part of a much larger effort to protect democratic institutions from corruption that threatened their fundamental integrity. And Agent Phoenix was already planning her next contribution to that effort, knowing that somewhere in Portland, criminals who believed they were untouchable were about to discover how wrong they were. The whispered codename that had cleared the Meridian City precinct had been just the beginning of a story that would continue in other cities, other investigations, and other confrontations between federal justice and criminal corruption. The work never ended, but neither did the commitment to ensuring that justice prevailed, regardless of how powerful the criminals believed themselves to be. Have you ever witnessed corruption that seemed too big to challenge? Or seen justice served when it seemed impossible? Sometimes the quiet person in the room isn't just observing, they're documenting everything. Share your thoughts on how we balance law enforcement authority with accountability in the comments below. Hit that like button if you believe no one is above the law. Subscribe for more stories of justice prevailing against impossible odds. And ring that notification bell because next week we're diving into the undercover IRS agent who exposed a billion-dollar tax evasion scheme by pretending to be a small-town accountant. Your next incredible story is already waiting on screen. Don't miss it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.